In a quiet town in South Carolina, a tragedy unfolded that would leave people in shock and disbelief. This is the story of 14-year-old Heather Bayard, a girl who, despite facing overwhelming medical challenges from birth, had the will to survive. But in the end, her life was stolen from her in a way that no one could have predicted. Heather was born prematurely, just 28 weeks into her mother's pregnancy. Doctors weren't sure she would make it. But Heather proved them wrong. She survived, though her body carried the weight of several serious conditions: cerebral palsy, chronic lung disease, and epilepsy. These weren't just medical diagnoses, they were daily realities that required constant care. She wasn't able to walk or speak, but Heather had a way of communicating. She used her eyes, her expressions. Those who took the time to understand her could see the intelligence and the heart that shone through. And for most of her life, Heather's family were supposed to be the ones to take care of her. Her father, David, her mother, Bobby Joe, and her older brother, Edward. Edward, who had been trained as a personal care assistant, was paid by the state to provide Heather with the help she needed. The family was given over $25,000 in state funding to ensure Heather was cared for, and for a while, that should have been enough. But, as time went on, things began to unravel. As the pandemic struck, their lives became more isolated. Medical appointments were canceled, and the family shut themselves off from the rest of the world. It wasn't just the world outside that was shutting them out, the Bayards began to isolate Heather, too. The system that was supposed to be keeping an eye on her, ensuring she was healthy and safe, failed to do so. And then, one day in April 2022, Heather was brought to a hospital. She was unresponsive, her body cold and gray. Her father, David, didn't seem to show any real concern. He was on his phone, scrolling through it while hospital staff rushed to revive her. But by the time they managed to get Heather into care, it was too late. She had already been dead for hours. The medical team was shocked when they saw her. Heather's body was in a condition no one could have imagined. Her legs were severely decayed, practically unrecognizable. Her teeth were rotted, and her ears were filled with wax. Her skin was covered in rashes from being left in her own waste for far too long. The pneumonia she had developed was untreated, her lungs now filled with pus. The coroner later described it as one of the worst cases of neglect he had ever seen. When investigators went to the Bayard home, what they found was even worse. The house was a disaster. 40 animals, including dogs and cats, lived there, roaming freely in filth. Trash was piled high, and the stench of urine and decay was overwhelming. The place was overrun by rodents and insects. In the middle of this chaos was Heather's crib, where she had spent her last days, alone and neglected. The state had paid for Heather's care, expecting her family to take care of her. But instead, the system was abused. The Bayards, the very people who should have been Heather's protectors, allowed her to rot away in this horrific environment. As people began to process the horror of Heather's death, questions started to rise. How could something like this happen? How did the system miss it? How did the people responsible for her care allow her to suffer like this, unseen and unheard? There are no simple answers, but one thing is clear: Heather's death wasn't just the result of a family's failure, it was the failure of an entire system designed to protect vulnerable children. As we look deeper into Heather's case, we begin to understand not only the shocking details of her life and death but also the systemic issues that allowed this tragedy to unfold. Heather Bayard's story is a stark reminder of what can happen when we fail to protect those who need it the most. The aftermath of Heather Bayard's death was a gut-wrenching shock to everyone who knew the family or had ever heard her story. For Heather's extended family, the news was devastating. Her life, which had already been one of constant struggle, ended in unimaginable neglect. Family members and friends couldn't reconcile the bright, determined child they remembered with the state she had been left in. Heather had fought so hard to survive from the very beginning, but no one could have predicted the brutality of her final months. As investigators began piecing together what had happened inside the Bayard home, they learned that Heather's family had been keeping her in isolation for much longer than anyone could have imagined. The COVID-19 pandemic had certainly made things more complicated for families around the world, but for Heather, it seemed to have served as a convenient excuse to shut out the world entirely. No one came to check on her. No one from the state monitored her care. No family members were allowed to visit. This isolation was not only detrimental to Heather's physical health but also to her emotional well-being. She was a young girl, trapped in a broken body, and cut off from the people who cared about her the most. According to the records and testimonies from Heather's family, they had noticed her deteriorating health in the months leading up to her death. Her breathing had become labored, her once bright eyes had dulled, and her body seemed to be giving up. But rather than seeking immediate medical attention, Heather's mother, Bobby Jo, did something that no one could quite understand. On the night of Heather's final moments, Bobby Jo claimed that Heather's oxygen levels had dropped to a dangerously low 30%. For context, a normal oxygen level should fall between 95% and 100%. Anything lower can lead to severe complications, even death. But instead of calling 911 or adjusting her oxygen, Bobby Jo decided to put her daughter in a bathtub, hoping that the cold water would somehow revive her. To anyone who understood the complexity of Heather's condition, this was nothing short of dangerous. Heather had a tracheostomy tube, which meant her airway was managed artificially. Dunking her in cold water wouldn't have done anything to help her oxygen levels. It was a desperate attempt, a misguided choice at best, and an unforgivable mistake at worst. Once Heather was finally rushed to the hospital, it was too late. Medical staff found her in a condition so far beyond what they had ever seen before. Her body was covered in sores, her skin was mottled and gray, and she had the unmistakable signs of extreme neglect. In fact, her condition was so severe that some hospital staff later admitted it would have been kinder for Heather to have been killed quickly than to suffer such prolonged and unimaginable pain. The forensic pathologist who examined Heather's body could hardly believe what he saw. The level of decay was staggering. Heather's body had been left to rot. Her legs were described as raw hamburger, with skin that was no longer intact, as though it had been dissolved away. The extreme diaper rash that covered her body indicated she had been left in her own filth for months, perhaps even longer. The ulcers on her skin were so severe that they left permanent scars, and her organs had begun to shut down, overwhelmed by infections, including the untreated pneumonia that had ravaged her lungs. The autopsy revealed the most horrifying detail of all. Heather had essentially rotted to death, her body slowly breaking down due to a lack of oxygen, unsanitary conditions, and systemic neglect. Investigators who entered the Bayard home were unprepared for what they would find. The house, once a home, had become a filthy, stinking nightmare. The authorities discovered over 40 animals, dogs, cats, and other creatures, living in the house, all of them suffering from flea infestations, worms, and severe malnutrition. The stench inside was so overwhelming that officers were forced to wear respirators and protective suits just to enter. Trash was piled high, and the floors were covered in feces and urine. Flies, maggots, and cockroaches were everywhere. But amidst the filth, there was something even more disturbing: Heather's crib. It was in a back room, tucked away from the rest of the house. It was covered in trash, soiled and dirty. The space was small, and it was clear that Heather had been left there to suffer alone, surrounded by the horror of her own living conditions. The crib, meant to be a safe place for a child, had become a tomb. This revelation shook the entire community. How could Heather's own parents, who had received thousands of dollars in state funding to care for her, let her live in such conditions? How could they stand by while their daughter withered away, ignored and neglected for so long? The investigation into Heather's death eventually led to the arrests of her father, David, her mother, Bobby Jo, and her brother, Edward. All three were charged with her murder. Edward, who had been employed to care for Heather, was held accountable for his failure to perform his duties. Despite his training, he had never fulfilled the role he was hired to do. The state had placed trust in him, but instead of providing the care Heather desperately needed, he allowed her to be neglected and ignored. David and Bobby Jo were charged with both neglect and murder. The shocking thing was that, even in the face of their daughter's death, they never seemed to show any real remorse or emotion. When Heather was brought to the hospital, David appeared to be uninterested, scrolling on his phone as his daughter's life slipped away. It was as though her suffering was a burden he couldn't be bothered to acknowledge. In the wake of the arrests, Heather's extended family spoke out, expressing their grief and disbelief. They remembered her as a sweet girl, someone who had fought for her life from the very beginning. Her aunt and friends reflected on how Heather had defied the odds, how, despite the doctor's predictions that she wouldn't survive, she had grown into a young girl full of life and spirit. And yet, in the end, that spirit was crushed by the people who were supposed to protect her the most. Her story became a painful reminder of the importance of the systems that are supposed to protect vulnerable children. Heather's death raised questions not only about the responsibility of the people who directly harmed her but about the larger system that allowed her to fall through the cracks. This wasn't just a case of a child being abandoned by her family, it was a failure of the very systems that were put in place to care for children like her. As more details continue to emerge, the shocking truth about what happened to Heather Bayard has made it clear, this wasn't just a tragedy. It was a system failure, and it was a tragedy that could have been avoided. Where was the oversight? Records show that Heather hadn't seen a doctor in more than a year. Her tracheostomy and feeding tubes required constant maintenance. Without it, even a minor infection could become deadly. But the signs of neglect weren't minor. Her body, by the end, was essentially decomposing while she was still alive. That kind of deterioration doesn't happen overnight. It happens over months. Slowly. Painfully. And still, no caseworkers, no check-ins, no investigations. Some members of Heather's extended family said they tried to visit but were turned away. COVID restrictions were used as an excuse, but behind closed doors, something far darker was happening. One relative later described how Heather's mother would keep the home sealed off, turning away family with vague explanations or claiming that Heather was sleeping or not feeling well. But inside that home, Heather wasn't resting. She was rotting. The floor beneath her crib was stained with old blood, urine, and feces. The walls around her were crawling with bugs. The animals in the house were covered in fleas, many of them sick or dying themselves. It was a place unfit for any living being, let alone a child completely dependent on others for survival. When officers removed the surviving animals, they counted more than 40 in total. Several of them had to be euthanized due to poor health. The fleas were so bad that paramedics responding to the scene later reported being bitten during the call. Heather's room smelled of decomposition. The window had been sealed. There was no ventilation, no fresh air. Just darkness, heat, and the stench of death. And Heather's body told the story her voice never could. The medical examiner concluded that she had suffered from severe malnutrition. Despite being fed through a tube, her weight was dangerously low. It was clear that she hadn't been receiving enough food or hydration. Her feeding machine had been unplugged more than once. The pneumonia in her lungs was untreated and had likely caused her oxygen levels to dip for days, maybe even weeks, before her death. Even her tracheostomy tube, her literal lifeline, had been left clogged and dirty. The community, once shocked, was now angry. Vigils were held in Heather's memory, with candlelight ceremonies and moments of silence. People left teddy bears and flowers outside the house where she died, now abandoned and boarded up. Local activists demanded reform. How had this happened under the watch of state agencies? Why was no one held accountable for failing to monitor her care? How many more disabled children were out there, tucked away behind closed doors, suffering in silence? And then, the uncomfortable truth began to surface. Heather's death wasn't just an isolated tragedy, it was a symptom of a broken system. State agencies had been overwhelmed for years, understaffed and underfunded. Home visit requirements had been loosened, especially during the pandemic. Some caregivers went unchecked for months. In many cases, caseworkers were assigned more clients than they could realistically handle. Reports were filed and forgotten. Calls went unanswered. And children like Heather slipped through the cracks. Some insiders admitted privately that they had flagged the Bayard home more than once, but nothing ever came of it. The system was reactive, not preventative. Unless someone made a serious report or visible complaint, nothing would trigger a deeper investigation. As long as the paperwork was in order, the checks continued. Heather became a name in a file, a number in a system designed more for efficiency than for safety. As the Baynards sat in jail cells awaiting trial, the public outcry only grew louder. This wasn't just about Heather anymore. It was about a deep, festering problem with how society treats its most vulnerable, the disabled, the voiceless, the forgotten. People demanded answers, but more than that, they wanted change. Real, systemic change. Heather's story forced the spotlight onto Indiana's adult and family services, particularly the system of Medicaid waivers, state and federal funds used to help families care for individuals with disabilities at home. It's a program built on trust, that the caregivers being paid are actually providing care. But trust, without verification, is a breeding ground for abuse. And Heather's death proved it. What people couldn't wrap their heads around was the sheer duration of the neglect. How long do you have to ignore a child before she literally begins to decay in her bed? Days? Weeks? No, it took months. Months of silence. Months of missed opportunities. Months of pretending that everything was fine as long as the forms were filled and the checks kept coming. Behind the scenes, investigators uncovered even more disturbing details. The feeding tube had been shut off on multiple occasions. The logs for medical maintenance were either falsified or never kept. No emergency calls had ever been made, even as Heather's condition spiraled. There were signs that the family had disconnected the feeding equipment not just out of ignorance, but out of convenience. Less noise. Less mess. Out of sight, out of mind. It became clear they had stopped seeing her as a human being. Some speculated whether the financial incentives themselves played a role in Heather's death. With each month that passed, the Baynards received state money they used, by all accounts, on everything but Heather. The house was cluttered with electronics, large televisions, even signs of drug use. The irony? The very payments that were supposed to sustain her care may have motivated her neglect. As long as Heather stayed alive, the checks kept coming. But providing real care? That required effort. Compassion. Humanity. Things the Baynards seemed to lack entirely. And Heather? She suffered through it all in silence. The most heartbreaking part of Heather's story was the one no one could answer. What did she feel in those final weeks? Did she know she was dying? Did she wonder why no one came to help her? Could she sense that she'd been abandoned, even by the people who were supposed to love her most? When prosecutors revealed that she had been left alone for hours on end, sometimes in total darkness, with no television, no music, no voices, nothing but the sound of her own labored breathing, it broke something in the courtroom. Even the most seasoned investigators looked away when the photos were shown. And the jury? Some wept. Heather's death was ruled a homicide. Her cause of death, pneumonia due to chronic neglect and starvation. It was not sudden. It was not peaceful. It was slow. And it was painful. As the trial progressed, the Baynards showed little reaction. At one point, Bobby Jo reportedly leaned back in her chair and yawned during a witness's testimony. Edward, the supposed caregiver, stared at the floor. David avoided eye contact with the jury. There were no outbursts, no statements of innocence. Just a quiet, disturbing detachment, as though they still didn't believe they had done anything wrong. But the community did. People began calling for criminal charges not just against the family, but against the agencies who failed to intervene. Lawsuits were filed. Advocacy groups rallied for change, demanding stricter oversight, mandatory in-person welfare checks, and real accountability when caregivers fall short. Heather's case became a symbol of everything that can go wrong when bureaucracy replaces compassion. Her name was etched into protest signs. Her photo, once buried in a family album, now circulated on social media as a symbol of the system's failure. She had been hidden in life. In death, she was finally being seen. And yet, the deeper question remained, would anything really change? Because for every Heather Bayard, there are countless others we'll never hear about. Children with disabilities, living in silence behind closed doors, forgotten by a system that's supposed to protect them. How many of them are being cared for in name only, while their lives quietly waste away? Heather's story is not an outlier. It's a warning. This is what happens when compassion is replaced with complacency. When oversight becomes optional. When the people we trust to protect the vulnerable choose convenience over conscience. In the end, the court found the Bayards guilty. They will serve long sentences. But for many, that verdict came far too late. Heather was already gone. Her suffering could not be undone. And no amount of justice can bring back the years she lost, years she spent alone, neglected, invisible. Her grave is quiet now. Clean. Peaceful. People come by and leave flowers. Some leave notes, apologizing for not seeing her sooner. For not speaking up. For not saving her. What kind of world do we live in, where the state pays a family to let their disabled daughter rot to death? And more terrifying, how many more Heathers are still out there, waiting for someone to care? We want to hear from you. Do you think the state should be held just as accountable as the family? Was this pure negligence, or something even darker? Drop your thoughts, your theories, or your questions down in the comments. Let's talk about it, because silence is part of what allowed this horror to happen in the first place. If this kind of true crime content matters to you, don't forget to like, subscribe, and turn on notifications so you never miss a case we uncover. We dig deep to bring these stories to light, stories that deserve to be told. Until next time, stay aware, stay questioning, and most of all, stay human.